All right, for today I got a Honda that's having some trouble starting. So it actually got towed in because it wouldn't start. And I'll show you what it's doing here. Okay, so it cranks really slow and really long, like the battery's dead. So the customer actually had put in a brand new battery. So he put in a brand new battery because with the cranking slow like that, he assumed he needed a battery and actually didn't quite get the terminals tight enough to where it actually wouldn't even start and had to be towed here. So I'm gonna go through, test that new battery, make sure it's good. I already tightened up the battery cables. That's how obviously I got it in the shop, and show you what it's doing here. All right, so I've gone ahead and hooked up my battery tester. We're gonna do in-vehicle top post battery. Cold cranking is only 450 on this battery, which is pretty small. Test good, says it's got 480 out of 450. We're gonna check the starter. I'll go in here. Almost didn't start. See, it's pulling low volts. We only had 7.19 volts on starting, which tells me that, shut that off here quick. If we can read this here, but the system says low voltage on the starting and that the battery was good, which tells me that we had good connection on the cables, because if the battery stayed with high voltage and it cranked that slow, we may have had a bad connection on the cable where it wasn't drawing the battery down, but we definitely drew the voltage down on the battery, which would indicate a bad starter. So most likely the starter motor is drawing too much current, and that's causing our problem. Unfortunately, Honda decided they were going to put the starter under the intake manifold on this model, so we're going to go ahead and get this all ripped apart, and I'll show you where that's at. To start, first thing, disconnect the negative battery cable. Also, this intake boot, I noticed when I was looking at it before, it has a rip in it, so I went ahead and ordered a new one of these. Surprised the car wasn't here for a cutting out condition. Obviously the mass airflow sensor, you'd be sucking air in here. That should have caused some kind of a running problem, but we're gonna get this pulled off and replaced, and we're gonna get the intake manifold removed. Start by popping a couple hose clamps off here. That out there. Get that out. But yeah, it's got a big tear right in the boot. Okay, so now this line is actually coolant that runs through here through the throttle body. I'm not sure if I have to take that off or if I can just kind of pull it and set it out of the way. I'm gonna go ahead and remove the 12mm bolts that hold the intake plenum on. I always like to break everything loose by hand. You're much less likely to break something or snap a bolt off if you're using your hands to do it. Okay, so I got the bolts out of the upper plenum. This part of the air cleaner is in my way. There's a couple little clips that either we have to pop this whole plastic thing off, but I'm going to try and get them out without that. Get that out of there. Now there's two bolts coming up from this direction from the bottom that hold the plastic on. All right, I got them broken loose. I'm going to use a stubby wrench. Got a ratcheting stubby. That'll let it get in there real easy. So now the manifold is loose. Got to figure out this wiring, how we're going to do that. Looks like we unplugged it there. Okay, down on this wiring harness down here, there's a 10mm that bolts the harness to the intake. I'm gonna go ahead, swivel and pop that out of my way. That way I got all this wiring loose. So we should be able to slide the intake past the studs there. Maybe. Still kind of caught because that bottom stud. So the bracket on the bottom is holding me up and I can't quite get it out, so I gotta loosen that. All right, so on the bottom of the intake manifold, there's a steel plate that comes off the block and bolts onto the bottom of the intake with 2 bolts coming this way. You gotta take that loose on the bottom in order to have enough clearance to get past your studs. This hose is just air. I'm gonna go ahead and remove it off of here. Don't want to damage the hose. We got these wires are fine. Disconnect the throttle body so you don't put pressure on those wires. Hopefully. Popped off. Okay. So now we have coolant in this hose. This hose is air also. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it. It's got them stupid little pinch clamps on it. Okay. And now this connector down here. Now our wires are out of the way. We've got a vacuum line on this side of the intake that we have to pop off. Gotta get something to pop off. Okay. One more line here, PCB line. Which runs behind the intake manifold to the block. And there you have it. Should be able to get it right up out of your way. All right, so you're gonna have a vacuum line that connects to here. There's going to be one that connects into here that runs down the back side. You have this vacuum hose, which connects to the PCB valve, and that exposes your starter right there. So I'm going to go ahead and switch around the camera so we can see where we're at over here. What we got here is a single clip, which is your start wire, and you're going to have the main battery cable bolted onto the starter. Looks like it's a 12 millimeter. And then there should be 2 bolts that hold the starter on. Looks like we got a 14 for both of them. So go ahead and get them unbolted. There's also a oil sending unit or knock sensor. Not sure which it is. Looks like a knock sensor. That I'm going to disconnect the wire just so that's not in our way. We got to make sure we remember to put that back on. All right, so we got our bolt on top of the starter, which is a 12 mil. That'll work. Okay. And we got our battery cable disconnected. We can pull that up out of the way. And 2 mounting bolts that hold the starter on. I probably said 9/16. They're actually 14 millimeters because this is a Honda. But again, let me crack them loose by hand. Oh, actually I was wrong. One is a 14 and the other one is probably a 17. Seems the front bolt is larger. She's good and tight. Oh yeah, she was stuck pretty tight. All right. All right, now that I got them cracked loose, I'm gonna go at it with a swivel socket extension. See if I can't zip them out of there pretty quick here. One. And it'd be harder to get on. Two. Show you these bolts here. Your 17 is in the front and it goes all the way through the engine block into the transmission, which is why it's larger. And then this is kind of a special bolt that goes behind the starter. It's got this long head to make it easier to get out for you. Just like that. Starter can be removed. And get out from under that harness. And there it is, ready for a new one. All right, so you get your starter out, you verify that they're the exact same. You don't have to transfer over any of these brackets that hold the wiring or anything like that. Should be good. Gonna go ahead and get this nut off now. And get the little lock washer. Definitely wanna make sure you reuse or put a new one of those on. Go ahead and get your starter back down in the hole and reverse exactly how you took it apart. So we got 33 and 47 as our two different torque specs for our bolts here. Go ahead and get the wrench down on there. Just like that. Our bolts are torqued for the starter. We're gonna go ahead and get the wiring hooked up. Okay, so we're gonna get our wires. They'll be tucked out of the way here. Hold back up and get main battery cable stuck in there. Connect our small cable, and then the new lock nut, or the new lock washer and nut are going to get installed. Reconnected the wiring to the back of the starter where it clips into that little bracket, and then tighten up your I think it's a knock sensor, it might be an oil sending unit, whatever it is. Make sure your harness is all in good shape and in place. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna replace these gaskets. And we'll pull these old ones out and throw new ones in there. All right, now once you got all four of those nice and smooth and flat, properly installed, we're gonna lower the manifold back into the hole here. And we gotta make sure we hook up all these hoses and get all these vacuum lines in the right places. So there's a couple little clips, a couple lines. Let's go ahead and make sure we don't pinch anything underneath the manifold. These hoses come out into this little bracket. Like that. The PCD valve. Gotta make sure you get that put back on. The hose clamp. All right. Double check that all the gaskets are still in place like they're supposed to be. Push your manifold where it belongs and go ahead and start putting the bolts back in with your fingers. Again, making sure everything gets started so you don't cross-thread any bolts. I'm gonna make sure I get the manifold torqued before I put the bracket on the bottom. That way it's not holding it out on the bottom and the manifold tightens up nice and flat. So we'll get these all down and then hit them with the torque wrench. All right, so it says my intake should be 16 foot-pounds. So we're gonna go down and start in the middle and work our way to the edges. And torque all the bolts and nuts to 16. All right, so the intake's torqued. Now what we have to do is come up from the bottom with the bracket and get the 2 bolts on from the bottom. Okay, and I didn't get the bolt lined up when I put the intake on, so I'm gonna take the bracket all the way off and just stick it over the stud. Sometimes you get lucky and you'll pull the stud with the nut. Unfortunately, only one of the nuts came with the stud and the other stud was still in there, so I had to take the lower bolt out of the bracket. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that lower bracket down there tightened up. It's this one right here, and the bolts come in from the bottom. This wiring harness is the next step. 10mm bolt holds it to the intake. All right, just gonna walk you through the final steps here. Last thing I showed you was we were putting the wiring harness on. Went ahead and got that all plugged in and attached. Went through and connected all the vacuum lines here. There's one on the side of the intake down here, and then that tube that runs to the PCB. Went ahead and put in our new air duct without a hole and connected our negative battery cable back up. Throttle position sensor, or throttle body, I should actually say, throttle by wire. That connector I also reattached. Everything should be connected. This thing should start and sound a lot better. Let's hit the key and see how much better it sounds. Oh yeah. No effort, that thing cranks right up. So definitely the starter was causing a heavy drag. I'll go ahead and quick hook the tester up just so you can see the numbers and the difference between what the old starter current drew versus the new starter. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and retest it the same way. Shows a good battery. Gonna go ahead and do the starter test. And then we can go back here. Cranking normal at 11.02. Let's get back to it again here. Yeah, it dropped the voltage down to 11.02 volts, and before we were at like 7.1. So the current draw was much more severe with the old starter. This starter's working normally and it sounds much better. So I went ahead and I disassembled the motor just to see exactly what went wrong with it. And as you can see here, the brushes don't look too terrible. There's a little bit of discoloration on the positive side of the brushes. The ground sides still look fine and they're not burnt at all. You can see here the armature still looks pretty good. This is where the brushes actually ride on the motor. And they're a little discolored, not super burnt. However, on the back side of the motor, we have a bronze bearing that is supposed to be pressed into the back of the motor housing. It actually popped out of there, and this is most likely what was causing the higher current draw, because this bearing was no longer seated in there properly. It was allowing the back of the motor to not be completely centered inside the magnets, which would have caused the excessive current draw. So starter fixed the problem. Just thought it was interesting to see why it happened. I thought I'd take it apart.